Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Tenant Side presented by Tactix Real Estate Advisors. Today is a very special day. We are joined by Glenn Blumenfeld, who is a managing principal at Tactix Real Estate Advisors. He's responsible for some skyline defining projects in Philadelphia, such as the FMC Tower and the Cira Centre. So I'm really excited to have him on the program today to talk to us about what's going on in the Philadelphia market, both on the business side and the commercial real estate side, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Glenn, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Dan. I've been dying to be on this show.
So a lot has changed over the last 3 months. You wrote an article pretty recently about how for the past 5 years or so, this has really been a very landlord-friendly market. Rents have been sky high. Vacancies have been very low. It's been a good time to be a landlord and a difficult time to be a tenant in Philadelphia. And I think a lot has changed over the past couple months, and sort of maybe the power structure has changed a little bit. How are companies thinking about office space when they do eventually get back to the negotiating table with prospective landlords?
So it's a great question. And I think what's really important, and I think where a lot of people are going to make very grave mistakes in the coming months, is you really have to distinguish the future, break the future down into two periods. One is between now and when we get a vaccine or a viable treatment for the coronavirus, and therefore people are no longer afraid of contagion. And then there's the rest of the future, okay? And a lot of people are trying to create hysteria about the next 12 to 24 months where we have this contagion, and saying, take a lot of space so you can spread out, redo all your furniture, give people higher walls and spread them out and get laminate workspace. Those, I think, are going to be some major mistakes made by companies who are reactionary to a temporal acute problem. When you're making a 10 or 15-year lease and you're designing and building out your space for a 12 to 24-month problem, that's going to be an issue. I think most companies will deal with the first period by continuing remote working until people feel safe, and then going forward, I think you will see things like remote working play out into the future, and we can talk about how I see that playing out. But again, I do think it's important that you distinguish those two periods of time, because they're going to result in very different behaviors.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think some of the things that we've talked about are companies going to remote work temporarily, but then even when they come back, they'll find that some of these teams don't necessarily need to come back into the office, at least in the capacity that they were before, which seems to me like it would cause tenants to take less space in the future, at least overall. Some companies may expand, but that will cause some maybe soft spots in the market where tenants will be able to have a little bit more leverage than they've had over the past few years.
No, that clearly seems to be right. And there's all kinds of issues that are brought up by this. And one of the things we've learned in the last 3 or 4 months is that a lot of heads down work can be done from home. If it's being done now where the kids are home, it certainly could be able to be done when the kids go back to school. Hopefully they go back to school soon. So if you, and there's been a Harvard study that shows that the average heads down worker has been putting in like over 2 hours a day more of working from home than they were doing in the office. So if you're an attorney, for example, and you have to write a brief or a memo or do some research, okay, and you would otherwise just go into the office, close your door, put your head down and work at your computer or at your desk. Now I think people are going to say, well, hell, I could just stay home and do that work now. So why are people, forget about the amount of space right now. What kind of space are companies going to have? If you're going to do your heads down work from home and you're not going to be shunned by your boss for doing that anymore, what are you doing as an executive to compel people to come into the office? And when I say compel them, I don't mean force them, but make them want to come into the office. And it's interesting because I think what's going to make people want to come into the office is social interaction. And that means more collaborative spaces, soft seating spaces, flexible work areas where I can sit next to you today, I can sit next to Sarah tomorrow, depending on who I'm working with. But people are going to want to come to the office to interact with people, not to seclude themselves in an office and be in a cocoon like that.
I agree completely, and I think it will change the power structure at these negotiations when people do get back to it, because companies will want to change their space up, how they're using it, get a little bit smaller, more efficient, try to cut costs as they get through this. And landlords on the other end, though, are going to do everything that they can do to sort of maintain the gains that they've made in the market over the past 5 or 10 years or so. So how are landlords trying to bridge this gap that you're talking about to get themselves to the other side of this? Without sort of succumbing to these market forces that will open up these vacancies in the market?
Well, look, one of the other big dangers you can do in this business or any business is draw generalities and fail to recognize that each landlord, each building, each tenant will be differently situated. Mm-hmm. That's one real danger. I think a lot of people in this industry like to homogenize things because it makes it easier for them if they can convince everyone that everyone's the same and there's a market, but that's kind of not the case. The thing I think it's important to understand is change in real estate markets don't happen overnight generally. You know, put aside a 9/11 where millions of square feet of office space disappeared overnight. These kinds of market corrections are going to take years to play themselves out completely, because you can't just shed space 2 years into a 10-year lease.
Right.
So demand for office space as a result of this remote working phenomenon will ultimately reduce demand for office space, drive rents down, assuming it's not offset by, more businesses coming to Philadelphia, let's say, and increasing demand, right? Mm-hmm. But there's no doubt that in the long term, this will have the effect of reducing demand, reducing the rents. And I just wrote an article that'll come out in a week or two. It's interesting. We've added a new dimension to the real estate negotiation. Okay. In the past, we always talked about, once you defined how much space you needed, it was about rent and tenant concessions that you're fighting over. And if a company needed 20,000 square feet of space, it was relatively inelastic demand. If they needed it, they needed it. And if it was $30 in rent, they paid 30. If it was 35, they had to pay 35. What we're going to see going forward is, with remote work and hoteling and things, tenants will have a lot more flexibility in deciding how much space they need. There'll be the space they absolutely have to have, and then there'll be a component of their space program, which would be, if the price is right, I'll take the extra space to provide this stuff, right? So in a market like Philadelphia, where the rents might be in the 30s, okay, they might have the luxury of overbuying real estate because it's cheap. Whereas in New York, they can say, I can take 50,000 square feet and everyone's going to get a desk and a chair, or I'll go to a 30,000 square foot model. I'll hotel people. I don't need the extra 20. It would have been a nice thing to have, but I know I can make it work with 30. So your real estate demand is going to be broken up into an inelastic demand for the core essential piece of the space, and an elastic demand for the nice to have, but don't have to have space. And that's going to be a bargaining chip for the tenant. Landlord, you want my extra 20,000 square feet, you're going to have to lower the rent or raise the concessions. And the landlord's going to, and the lenders are going to have to say, do I want the higher face rate and a higher vacancy that I'm going to have to fill, or do I want the bigger requirement and make a more compelling economic case so they take the extra space that they don't have to have anymore?
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. If you have teams who are working remotely currently and they're doing fine, well, maybe you bring them back to the office if the price is right. And you don't bring them back to the office if the price isn't right. And then you can pick your building depending on who you want to be in the office, what the price level is. So that really makes a lot of sense to me. And I could see that playing itself out over the next few years.
Yeah, and not only that, but if you take a 60,000 square foot requirement, there might be 3 or 4 options in the market for that. But if they say, you know what, we're going to go to a hoteling concept, we're going to let people work from home more, we can really get this down to 32,000 square feet. Well, now all of a sudden you have 12 options in the market, and the more competition's always really good for tenants, right? So, and you're now going to be competing Well, if I go to building A, I'm going to take 47,000 square feet because the rent's lower. If I go to building B, I'm only going to take 32,000 square feet because the rents are higher. It's not just an economic exercise anymore. Now you're bringing in the value, the variables about which one supports my corporate culture better, which one helps me recruit better, because I can't afford as much space with this option as I can with that option. And it's going to make it harder for landlords to compete because it's not going to be an apples to apples competition anymore.
Right, right. It's more space in your building or less than somebody else's, and there's no way to sort of to back that out to sort of figure out what you're thinking on that. That makes a lot of sense to me. So you mentioned there was this period before we have the vaccine, and that makes a lot of sense to me because a lot of things are sort of in limbo. And I think that we all agree that there will be a vaccine. There will be another side to this. People differ on what the timing of that might look like. But presumably, we're going to find ourselves in a post-COVID world at some point in the next 2 to 3 years. What do you think that looks like, and how quickly are people going to want to get back to their offices? What does sort of the post-COVID world look like in your view?
So, look, if I was a betting person, I would say that there are going to be a lot of people who are going to want to go back to work some of the time. Okay. I mean, let's not forget that probably the biggest disruptor in the commercial office market over the last 5 years, 10 years, has been co-working.
Mm-hmm.
And put aside whether these business models were run properly, whether they overexpanded and they were valued correctly.
I have a lot of thoughts about that, but we can put it aside for right now.
We can put that aside for left. But what you can't dispute is that they really led a revolution, and they filled a real need in the market because these spaces were getting gobbled up and being used by people. And the initial consumers of co-working spaces were really the work from homers, mm-hmm. who were tired of the isolation. They were desperate for a community. They saw synergies from the ecosystem being created in these communities, and they came in droves. Now, later, it got supplemented by the enterprise businesses, the larger enterprise businesses. But they're suffering right now because of the threat of contagion. They're everything that you don't want to do right now. They're common areas without walls and, lots of different people in your space that you can't really control. So, again, put them in the first bucket of the next 12 to 24 months. But I don't think that anything has changed that in human nature to want social interaction. So I think people are going to want to come back to the office, but I also think that they now will feel comfortable and their bosses will feel more comfortable. You want to work a couple of days from home, do that, right? And look, if you had interviewed most, real estate facilities people at most companies and said pre-pandemic, what percentage of the time are people's butts in their seats? In a lot of these cases, you probably say 40 to 50% of the time. And that was before working from home was, an accepted paradigm for a lot of companies. So at what point does that percentage get so low that the company says, look, I can't justify paying for a dedicated seat 7 days a week? And by the way, the other thing that I think you're going to start seeing is the complete decimation of the concept of normal business hours.
I think we're already seeing that a little bit where people are sort of working when they wake up. There's no commute. You figure sit at your computer and get to work late at night. You may as well do it on the weekends. I agree with you.
Yeah. And if a person can the first step was you can work from anywhere. Well, once you can work from anywhere, you should be able to work at any time. So, maybe you have a person say, I'm going to work 2 20-hour days and I'm going to take the other 5 days off. If they can get the work done, then, the artificial boundaries of what was an acceptable workplace, WeWork changed that, then, where do you have to go into an office? Well, the work from home is going to change that. And I think what's acceptable work hours are going, or expected work hours, I should say. I think that's the next shoe to drop.
I agree. Glenn, thank you so much for joining me here on the Tenant Side, presented again by Tactix Real Estate Advisors. I really appreciate it. Some really great information in there for tenants out there in the market who are thinking about what the future of their office space looks like. Love to have you back again soon.
Love to do it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Glenn.